Rosalie Mercer dropped to her knees in the dirt beside a dying stranger and shoved her bare hand against the gash on his leg to stop the bleeding before she even knew his name. 300 pounds of woman alone on a failing ranch. 11 days after burying her father, and she didn't hesitate for a single second. The man was burning with fever, his leg twisted wrong, his horse too broken to carry him another yard. Every soul in the settlement had already decided she couldn't save herself. She saved him instead. If this story already has your heart beating faster, please subscribe to our channel right now and follow every part of this story to the very end. I promise you will not regret a single minute. Drop your city name in the comments below so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that July afternoon in eastern Montana and find out what really happened at Red Willow Ranch. The blood was everywhere before Rosalie had time to think about it. She had her hand pressed hard against the gash on the stranger's lower leg, her knee in the dry dirt, her full weight bearing down on a wound that was still seeping despite everything she was doing. And she was talking to him the way she'd talked to injured cattle low, and even not because she felt calm, but because Pentecost time she didn't have. "Stay with me," she said. "I need you to stay with me." He made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound that told her he was still in there. "Good," she said. "That's good. Keep doing that." His name was stitched inside the collar of his shirt. Rourke, which she only found because she'd torn the collar open to check his pulse. Strong enough. Too fast, but strong enough. The fever was what scared her more than the leg. Fever in July heat, miles from the nearest settlement, with a wound that had been open long enough to attract every kind of infection the territory had to offer. She looked at his horse. The gray roan was standing 4 feet away, head hanging nearly to the ground, reins trailing in the dust. The animal had been ridden hard and then left standing in the full summer sun without water. She clocked that problem, filed it, kept her hands on the wound. "Mr. Rourke," she pressed harder. He flinched. "Mr. Rourke, I need you to open your eyes." His eyes opened. Dark brown, unfocused, then sharpening by degrees. The way eyes go when a man is fighting his way back from somewhere he nearly didn't return from. "There you are." He looked at her. His mouth moved. "Don't talk yet," she said. "Just," he breathed. She looked at the wound. The bleeding had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed enough that she could think past the immediate emergency and start calculating what came next, which was the part of any crisis that Rosalie Mercer had always been better at than most people expected. She was 28 years old, and she weighed close to 300 pounds, and she had been running Red Willow Ranch alone for 11 days, since her father's heart gave out in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon without warning or ceremony. And she had learned in those 11 days that the particular kind of exhaustion she carried didn't announce itself until she stopped moving. So she didn't stop moving. She used the cleanest part of his torn collar to bind the wound tight enough to hold for the ride back to the house. She checked his shoulder, swollen and locked high, probably pulled from the socket and forced back in by a man with no one to help him. She checked his head for injury and found a bruise along his right temple, but nothing that made her fear a skull fracture. "Mr. Rourke." She sat back on her heels and looked him straight in the face. "My name is Rosalie Mercer. You are on my property. You have a bad leg wound and a shoulder injury and a fever that has no business being that high. My ranch house is 3/4 of a mile north, and I cannot get you there on horseback without making the leg worse." She paused. "I'm going to drag you on a canvas. It's going to hurt. I need you to tell me you understand." He stared at her. "Do you understand?" she said again. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice came out rough and stripped down, like a thing that had been left in the sun too long. "Good." She was already moving to Buttercup, pulling the rolled canvas from behind her saddle. "You can be angry about it afterward." "I'm not angry," he said. "Not yet," she said. She got the canvas positioned and got him onto it. which required more physical effort than she would ever describe to another human being, and a particular quality of stubborn focus that she had inherited directly from her father, who had once reset his own dislocated shoulder against a fence post, and then finished mending a water line because the cattle still needed water, and the water line still needed mending. She tied the leading edge of the canvas to Buttercup's saddle horn and walked beside it the whole 3/4 of a mile. One hand on the rope to control the angle, her eyes moving between the terrain ahead and the man on the canvas behind her. "How long were you down?" she asked. She kept her voice conversational. Keeping him talking kept him conscious, since he stopped. Started again. Yesterday evening. She did the arithmetic, 17, maybe 18 hours in the July heat with an open wound and a fever already climbing. "Rattlesnake," she said, a pause. "How did you know?" "The way your horse went down." And the way you landed, she'd seen it before. A horse that spooks hard sideways throws its rider differently than a horse that stumbles. You weren't seated right in the left stirrup. Another pause. "No. You tried to catch yourself with your right arm." "Yes. That's how you wrenched the shoulder." "Yes." She nodded. "That was the wrong instinct. But most people have it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you do this often? Drag injured strangers to our property?" "First time," she said. "You're very calm about it." "I'll be less calm later," she said. "Right now I have a 1/4 mile left and your wound is still seeping and your roan needs water before he goes down too. I'll save the being upset for when I have a free moment." Something changed in his breathing. She thought it might have been a laugh that got converted into something else before it fully arrived. She got him into the house and into her father's room, her father's bed, which still smelled faintly of him, in ways she was not ready to address, and she did what needed doing, with the directness of someone who has cleaned and dressed wounds before, and understands that the patient's comfort during the process is secondary to the patient's survival. She cleaned the gash with carbolic and water. She packed it. She wrapped it with clean linen and elevated the leg on a folded blanket. She put heat on the shoulder joint and strapped it into position. She got 3 cups of water into him and checked his temperature with the back of her wrist against his forehead and didn't like what she felt. "The fever is high," she told him. "I know," he said. "It may go higher before it breaks." "How long if it follows a normal course?" "The worst should be tonight. If it doesn't follow a normal course, we'll deal with that when we come to it." He looked at her with the first truly clear gaze he'd managed since she'd found him dark brown. Direct, carrying the particular weight of a man deciding how much of what he was thinking to say out loud. "You're very practical about all of this. A ranch doesn't run on sentiment," she said. "Neither do fevers." She was already at the door when he said, "Miss Mercer," she stopped. "I had nothing in my saddlebag worth stealing," he said. "In case that was a concern." She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Rourke, if I'd wanted to rob you, I'd have done it in the field and left you there. It would have been considerably easier." She put her hand on the doorframe. "Get some sleep. I'll check on you in 2 hours." She went to water his horse. The roan was a good animal, genuinely good, which she could tell within 30 seconds of handling him. Responsive. Steady-tempered despite everything he'd been through. Well-muscled through the hindquarters in a way that spoke of careful conditioning. She brushed him down thoroughly and put him in the second stall with water and hay and told him in the low, easy voice she used with all horses that he'd done well and that nobody was going to bother him tonight. Then she stood in the barn doorway for exactly 60 seconds and let herself feel how tired she was. 60 seconds. That was all she allowed. Then she went back to work. She had the cattle to check, the lower trough to monitor, the east fence section to note for tomorrow's ride. She had a letter to write to the Cattle Association about fall sale registration. She had a store account at Harlan Crow's Mercantile, sitting at a number she didn't like to look at directly, and a feed situation that required calculation, and a water system that was losing pressure somewhere between the creek diversion and the lower pasture that she hadn't isolated yet. She made soup from what she had: dried beans, salt pork, dried herbs from the strings above the kitchen window. She was rationing more carefully than she had told anyone, because the fall cattle sale was 3 weeks away, and there were decisions ahead of her that she was not yet ready to make, and the one thing she could control was what came out of this kitchen and how long it lasted. She made 2 bowls without thinking about it. She carried both down the short hall. Silas Rourke was awake, which was better than the alternative. He'd managed to get himself partially upright against the headboard, which had cost him something, and he looked at her, and then at the bowls, with the careful expression of a man who is not accustomed to being looked after and is trying to decide how to receive it. "Salt pork and beans," she said. "It's plain, it smells perfect," he said. She sat in the chair by the window. They ate in silence. Outside, the July heat pressed against the glass. Somewhere below in the south pasture, cattle moved. She clocked their movement by the particular quality of sound it made nothing alarmed. "Just shifting weight and routine grazing. Good. You've been running this ranch alone," Silas said. It wasn't a question. Since when? 11 days. He was quiet. Then, before that, "Your father? He passed 11 days ago." She said it the way she'd been saying it to everyone who asked, flat and forward, because the alternative required time she didn't have in the middle of a working day. "Heart. He was mending a harness near the barn door. I'm sorry." He said it the way people say it when they mean it, not the way they say it to close a door. "Thank you," she said. They ate another few minutes in silence. Then Silas said, "The roan's name is Gray. He's particular about how the left rein lies." "I should have told you before." She looked at him. "He let me handle him fine. I figured he would," Silas said. "He's a good judge." She set her empty bowl aside. "Tell me what you were riding toward." He told her about the Harrington contract in Miles City, 3 months of horsebreaking, starting the 1st of August. Good wages. The kind of work he'd been doing for 15 years across a territory that ran from the Dakotas to the edge of Wyoming, following the work wherever it was and building nothing permanent anywhere, which was a life that suited some men and wore others down to nothing. "Does it suit you?" she asked. He considered the question with more seriousness than she'd expected. "It did," he said finally. "I'm less certain than I used to be." She looked at him. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I try," he said. She gathered the bowls and stood. "The fever may spike tonight. If it goes significantly higher, call out and I'll hear you." "I'm a light sleeper, Miss Mercer." His voice stopped her at the door. "What do you think happens to this ranch if you don't make it to the fall sale?" She looked at him for a moment. It was an unusual question. Most people approached the topic with considerably more cushioning around it. "There are men in this settlement who have been waiting for that answer since before my father died," she said. "I don't intend to give them the satisfaction of finding out." He held her gaze. "What's the biggest problem between here and that sale?" "Water," she said immediately. "The creek is down. My diversion system isn't carrying enough volume to the lower pasture. I have an idea about a channel and holding pond configuration, but I haven't had the hands to implement it." He nodded slowly. "I'd like to hear about it." She looked at him feverish. "Injured, 2 days off a near-fatal accident in the middle of nowhere, asking her about her water system." "Rest first." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "But tomorrow," she said. She checked his fever at 9 o'clock. Still high, but not climbing. She checked again at midnight and found it the same. She sat in the chair beside the bed for a while in the lamplight. Not because he needed watching every minute, but because sitting was the closest thing to rest she was going to allow herself. And from the chair she could hear his breathing evening out into something steadier and more regular than it had been at sundown. She thought about the water drawings. She'd made 3 versions of the same idea, each one refining the last, all of them sitting in the bottom drawer of her father's desk, because the last time she'd brought up a land management idea in the settlement, she'd watched Harlan Crow's face go through its particular sequence of patient, gentle, ultimately dismissing expressions, and she decided the drawings were better kept to herself. She thought about the south fence, the east line pressure loss, the fall sale, and what it meant if the cattle weren't in condition by then. She thought about her father's hands going cold in hers on a Wednesday afternoon. She was back in her own room before 1 o'clock and asleep within minutes. The deep unconscious sleep of a body that has used everything it had and will take rest wherever it can find it. By the third day, Silas Rourke was upright. Not well, his leg was still heavily wrapped, and his shoulder still needed another week of careful treatment, but upright, and moving through the house on a crutch he had fashioned himself from the broken broom handle she'd left in the hall, which she hadn't told him about, which meant he had heard it fall from his room and logged the information without a word. He was at the kitchen table with her coffee when she came in from the morning cattle check, and he had the expression of a man who was entirely uncertain whether he had overstepped. "There's more in the pot," he said. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "You shouldn't be on that leg. It hurts less than yesterday. That's not the same as healed." "No," he agreed. "But I was going to lose my mind lying still." She understood that completely. It didn't mean she agreed with it, but she understood it. "How'd you find the broom handle?" she said. "Heard it fall when you walked past the first night." "You have good ear. You learn to," he said simply, in a way that implied a history she hadn't been told yet. She drank her coffee and looked at him across the table in the morning light. He was lean and weathered in the particular way of men who have spent most of their years working outdoors, not thin, but worn to the essential. All the extra stripped away by weather and labor. His eyes were calm and direct without being hard. He had a quality of stillness that she had noticed from the first morning, not passivity but control. The deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided what is worth responding to and what isn't. "Tell me about the pressure loss," he said. She set down her cup. "Your shoulder isn't healed enough for fence work." "I know that," he said. "Tell me about the loss. Where it starts, where it stops being consistent." "You said it was variable with weather?" She looked at him. Then she got up and got the drawings. She hadn't meant to. She had gotten up to check whether the bread from yesterday was still good, which it wasn't, and on the way back she had stopped at the drawer, and then there was no good reason not to show him, so she brought the drawings to the table and spread them out without ceremony. He looked at them. He didn't say anything immediately. He turned the paper once, then again, and he asked 2 questions, one about the soil composition at the proposed diversion point, and one about the elevation drop between the creek level and the holding area she had sketched. She answered both. He sat back. "This could work," he said. Rosalie sat very still. In 28 years of presenting practical ideas to practical men, including her father, who had believed in her more than anyone else in the territory, she had grown accustomed to a particular sequence. The pause, the careful expression, the slight recalibration of the eyes that meant someone was deciding how much weight to give what she had just said. Even her father, even on his best days, Silas Rourke had looked at her drawings for 6 minutes and said, "This could work." No careful expression, no recalibration. "The channel alignment is right," he said, pointing. "And the holding pond concept solves the evaporation problem you're fighting right now. This section here, you'll want to check the bank stability before you cut. The soil looks like it runs sandy about 3 feet down. But the design is sound. Who drew these?" "I did," she said. "How long have you been thinking about this?" 2 winters, she said. He nodded slowly. "You've been watching the water move." "My father taught me to watch before acting," she said. "He was right," Silas said. She looked at the drawings for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "If you're still here when you're mobile enough to ride, I'd like to show you the creek bend." He looked at her. "I'd like to see it." They were quiet after that. She found him in the barn on the 4th afternoon, talking to Gray in the low, deliberate way people use when they don't know anyone is listening. Not soft talk. Real talk, measured and honest, the way you talk to something you respect. Gray had his head slightly lowered and one ear turned toward Silas, with the particular quality of attention that horses only give to people they have decided are worth giving it to. Rosalie watched from the barn doorway for a few seconds. Then she walked past without saying she'd seen. On the 5th day, Harlan Crow came out from the settlement. He arrived in the late morning with his hat in his hands, and the look of a man who has rehearsed what he is about to say and is satisfied with how reasonable he sounds. Rosalie saw the wagon from the east fence and was back at the house before he'd finished tying his horse. "Rosalie," he said, and paused at the sight of Silas sitting at the kitchen table. The pause lasted slightly longer than politeness required. "Harlan," Rosalie said, "this is Silas Rourke. He had an accident near my south fence. He's recovering." She kept her voice even and informational. "Was there something you needed?" Harlan reset his expression and refocused. "It's the store account. The total has reached a point where I need to speak with you about reassurances." "Given the current situation." "What current situation is that?" Rosalie said. "Well," he turned his hat. "Your father's passing. The scale of what you're managing. The season. I'm sure you understand." "I understand that the fall sale is 3 weeks away," Rosalie said. "And that my cattle are in good condition and my water system is holding and my fences are sound. The account is considerable." "Rosalie," she agreed, "and it will be addressed at the sale. Same as it was last fall and the fall before that." Harlan shifted. He was a man who found it easier to have difficult conversations with people who showed signs of difficulty. And Rosalie was not showing signs of difficulty, which made him uncertain where to apply pressure. "The situation is somewhat different this fall," he said carefully. "Is it?" she said. "Well, your father and the question of whether one person can," he stopped himself. "Can what, Harlan?" She kept her voice pleasant and her eyes direct. He looked at his hat. "The account will need settlement no later than the end of October," he said. "That was always the arrangement," she said. "Yes." Well, he put his hat back on. "I wanted to be clear." "You've been clear," she said. He looked at Silas again. Silas was looking at the water drawings with the focused attention of a man who was in no way performing his lack of interest in the conversation. Harlan looked back at Rosalie. "There are people talking," he said. "Low. People always talk," Rosalie said. "Is there anything else?" Harlan left. Rosalie closed the door and stood facing it for a moment. "You handled that well," Silas said. "I always do," she said. She turned. "He'll come back harder in a week. He always works up to things." "What will you do?" "The same thing I always do." She sat down across from him. "Work. Show him results. Make it impossible for him to justify pulling the account before the sale." She looked at the water drawings. "Which is exactly why that channel needs to start being dug before the end of the month." Silas looked at his leg. "I'll be mobile in 4 days. Your leg won't take digging in 4 days, I know that," he said. "But I can work a line level. I can direct the grade." He met her eyes. "It's your design, Rosalie. I'm offering you 2 working hands and a back that isn't injured. The thinking is already done." She looked at him. "You're not going to thank me for that," he said. "No," she said. "But I'm going to take you up on it." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. On the 6th morning, Prudence Vale came. She drove herself in from the settlement with the particular posture of a woman who has made a decision and is at peace with it. She pulled up near the fence line, where Rosalie was checking the trough pressure, and looked down from the wagon with the expression that Rosalie knew meant a difficult conversation delivered gently. "I've heard about the man at your ranch," Prudence said. Without preamble. "He had an accident near my south fence," Rosalie said. "He's been recuperating." "An unmarried woman, Rosalie." Prudence's voice dropped to the register she reserved for moral concerns. "Living alone with a strange man on the property. People are drawing conclusions. I'm telling you as a friend." "What kind of conclusions?" "That your judgment may be affected." Prudence paused. "Some people are saying that grief does things to a person. That perhaps you aren't thinking clearly." Rosalie looked at her. She let the silence sit for a moment, Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she had learned that the first answer she reached for, when she was angry, was rarely the most effective one. "Prudence," she said finally. "I pulled a dying man out of the July heat and gave him medical care and a place to recover. If that reflects poorly on my judgment, I find I'm not particularly concerned about the judgment of anyone doing the reflecting." She looked up at her. Was there something else? Prudence studied her for a long moment. "He'll be leaving soon, when he's healed enough to ride." "Good," Prudence said. Then, more quietly, "People are going to test you this season." "Rosalie." "More than usual, you know that." "I know that," Rosalie agreed. Prudence clicked to her horse and drove on. Rosalie watched her go and thought, "That's already moving then, all of it." She went inside and found Silas at the window, which told her he'd heard. "Mrs. Vale?" "She means well," Rosalie said. "She just means it loudly. I'm costing you standing in the settlement." "My standing in this settlement was already complicated before you arrived," she said. "A woman my size, running land alone, people had already decided what they thought about that. You're just a new addition to the list of reasons they'd already assembled." She looked at him steadily. "Don't flatter yourself that you're the original problem." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Has anyone in this settlement ever given you a straight answer about anything?" "My father," she said. "Occasionally Harlan, when he forgets to be careful." "That's a short list," she said. "It is." He looked at her. "What did Pike offer you for the cattle?" She told him the number. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "That's theft." "That's what I told him," she said, in somewhat more diplomatic language. "You should have used the less diplomatic version." "I'll keep that in mind for the next visit," she said. Because there will be one, she was right. Gideon Pike arrived on the 7th afternoon. He came when the heat was at its worst. That was how Pike operated. She had noticed, always timing his visits to the hours when people were most worn down, most eager to conclude anything just to get back into shade. He rode up while Silas was in the barn and Rosalie was at the water trough, and he tipped his hat with the particular ease of a man who believes the outcome is already settled. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I've been thinking about your situation." "I wasn't aware I had a situation," she said. "Now, Rosalie." He used her first name the way people use a first name when they want to establish a familiarity that hasn't been offered. "Be honest with yourself. This heat, this season, the account with Crow. Your father gone, it adds up to a difficult position. It adds up to a challenging fall," she said. "Most ranchers have one occasionally." "Most ranchers have a partner," he said. She looked at him without expression. He named his price. Same number as before, below fall market by enough that she would be fighting for survival by spring. She kept her face perfectly still, the way she had trained herself to do when numbers were being used as weapons. "That," she said, "doesn't reflect the current market condition. The condition of my cattle or the quality of my water access, which is better than most operations in this basin right now. When you have a number that reflects those things, I'll hear it." He moved his horse slightly closer. "With the talk going around about that cowboy on your property, your options may be narrower than you're calculating. Buyer's talk. If your character becomes a question, Mr. Pike," her voice went flat and cold as creek water in January. "My character is not a bargaining point. My cattle are. When you are prepared to discuss my cattle at their actual value, you know where to find me." She looked at his horse, then at him. "I'd appreciate you getting off my land." The smile that moved across his face wasn't the one she'd expected. It was slower and more patient, the kind of smile that says, "I can wait." He turned his horse and rode out. Rosalie stood where she was until the dust had settled and the sound of hooves had gone entirely quiet. Then she said, without turning, "You heard that." Silas stepped out from beside the barn. He hadn't tried to intervene. He hadn't stepped forward or moved into the conversation or in any way positioned himself between her and Pike. He had simply been present. He said, "He'll try again," she said. "Yes. With other ranchers too, probably." using the drought and the heat and anyone who's already in trouble. She turned to look at him. He's been building towards something for a while. This isn't just about my cattle. Silas looked at her with the direct, quiet attention she had come to understand as the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. What do you think he's building toward? I don't know yet, she said. But I intend to find out before he gets there. That night they sat on the porch in the cooling dark after supper. It was the first time they had simply sat together, without a task in front of them, no drawings to examine. No logistics to calculate, no problem requiring immediate solution. Just the porch and the cooling air and the cattle settling somewhere below and the stars coming out hard and bright the way they did in eastern Montana on clear summer nights. Silas had his coffee, she had hers. They didn't talk for a while. Then he said, my father had a ranch, not a big one. Wyoming territory. He lost it when I was 17. She looked at him. Water rights, he said. A man with more money and fewer principles bought up the upstream access and cut his flow. My father held for 2 seasons, and then there was nothing left to hold. He drank his coffee. I left the territory after that, started breaking horses wherever the work was. Told myself I preferred moving, did you, she said. He was quiet for a moment, for a while, he said. She looked out at the dark land. My father used to say that the land doesn't care whether you love it. It just asks whether you'll show up for it. He sounds like he was a good man, Silas said. He was the best man I knew, she said simply, and I knew it while he was alive, which I'm grateful for. Comfortable now. The way silences get when 2 people have stopped trying to fill them. Rosalie, his voice was quieter than usual. She looked at him. When I'm healed enough to ride, he said slowly, I'm going to need to make a decision about the Harrington contract. I've already missed the start date. They may have found someone else. Probably, she said. If they have, he said, I'll need to find other work. She looked at the dark fields. At the cattle she couldn't see but could hear, the way she had always been able to hear them. The specific language of their movement that she had learned before she'd learned to read. At the water trough in the lower pasture that was holding because of a design she'd kept in a drawer for 2 years, waiting for someone to look at it straight. There's work here, she said, if you want it. Room and meals against labor until the value is even. He looked at her. That's not charity, she said. I have a water channel that needs digging, and a south fence that needs 3 new posts, and an east line with a cracked fitting I need someone to hold steady while I work the joint. I know it's not charity, he said. Then we understand each other. We do, he said. He drank his coffee, she drank hers. Below in the dark pasture, cattle moved against the summer night, quiet and purposeful, and entirely unaware that the woman watching over them had just decided, for the first time in 11 days, that she did not have to carry everything completely alone. She would not have called it relief, but that was the word that came closest. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the calculations and the logistics and the plans for tomorrow's fence work, something she had been holding so tightly for so long began, very slightly, to ease. She didn't look at Silas when she spoke again. The channel needs to start before the month is out, she said. The creek drops another inch in August and we lose the grade differential. I know, he said. I'll be ready, she nodded. The stars moved overhead the way they always moved, slowly, indifferently, magnificently, and Red Willow Ranch held on beneath them the way it had always held on. Because Rosalie Mercer had never once let it do anything else. And for the first time, as she sat in the cooling dark with her coffee going cold in her hands and the sound of a man's steady breathing beside her, she let herself believe that holding on might become something slightly different. Not just survival, something she hadn't let herself name yet. Something that felt dangerously and quietly, and for the first time in a very long time, like the beginning of enough. The channel was Rosalie's idea and Rosalie's design, but it was Silas's back that broke the first ground. He was mobile enough by the 10th day, not fully healed. Not anywhere close to what he would have called functional under normal circumstances. but mobile enough that standing him beside a grade line with a level in his good hand and telling him to call out when the bubble drifted was work he could do without making anything worse. She had already mapped the cut the evening before, walking it twice in the last of the daylight, driving stakes at the intervals that mattered. When she came out at first light with the tools, he was already at the first stake, studying the grade with the focused expression of a man who has done this long enough to read terrain the way other people read print. "You moved the third stake," he said without looking up. She stopped. "I did. Last night, the will runs harder 6 inches left of where I'd originally planned, and I didn't want the cut drifting." He looked up then. "That's the right call." "I know," she said, and handed him the level. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that surprised her. She dug and he directed, not with the careful, over-explained language of someone managing a person they don't trust, but in the shorthand of people who have already established that both of them understand the problem. He called adjustments by degree, not by instruction. She made them without stopping to confirm. After the third adjustment, they stopped talking about the grade at all and just worked. The way you work when communication has gotten efficient enough to disappear. By mid-morning, the first 30 feet of channel were cut clean and true. Rosalie leaned on the shovel handle and looked at it. 30 feet of her own design, running exactly the angle she'd calculated on paper 2 winters ago, carrying the runoff water away from the creek bank and toward the holding area with a precision she hadn't fully believed would translate from drawing to dirt until she saw it. "It's going to work," she said. "It was always going to work," Silas said. "You just hadn't dug it yet." She looked at him. "That's a different thing than saying I was right." "No," he said. "It isn't." He handed the level back to her. "You designed a sound The only question was execution." He looked at the cut. "You have good execution." She went back to digging. But she carried that for a while. She carried it the way you carry something you hadn't known you were hungry for until someone handed it to you. They were 20 minutes into the second section when the riders came. There were 2 of them men she recognized from the settlement. Riders who worked for Gideon Pike's operation, though they wore nothing that said so. They pulled up at the fence line and watched without speaking. She kept digging. Silas kept the level steady and said nothing. The riders sat there for 4 minutes by her count and then turned and rode back the way they came. "Scouts," said after they'd gone. "Yes," she said. "He's mapping your water progress." "Yes," she said again. She drove the shovel into the ground, which means he knows the channel is real and not just an idea. "And that changes his timeline," Silas said. She stopped and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Pike is operating on the assumption that this ranch fails before the fall sale," Silas said. "Everything he's done, the low cattle offer, the talk about your reputation, the pressure on Crow, it all requires you to be in a desperate enough position to sell or fold. If your water system works, your cattle come through the drought in good condition. If your cattle come through in good condition, you make the sale. If you make the sale, you're not desperate." He looked toward where the riders had gone. He just watched you dig 30 feet of a solution he didn't account for. He's going to move faster now. Rosalie stood with the shovel in her hands and thought about that. "Then we dig faster," she said. They worked until the light failed. She made supper while Silas washed up at the pump, and she could hear him moving around the yard with a gait that was improving every day, still careful. Still weighted differently than it would be when the leg was fully healed, but more confident than it had been 3 days ago. She had noticed, without letting herself make too much of it, that he moved through her property with a kind of ease that had nothing to do with familiarity, and everything to do with a man who had learned to make himself useful in whatever space he occupied. He didn't rearrange things. He didn't take ownership of tasks that weren't offered. He worked in the gaps, the things she hadn't gotten to, the things she didn't have enough hands for, and left the decisions to her. It was such a specific kind of consideration that she suspected it was deliberate. "Tell me about Wyoming," she said when they sat down to eat. He looked at her. What part? The part where your father lost the ranch. He was quiet for a moment. The way he was quiet when he was deciding how much of something to say. Man named Caldwell, he said finally. Fletcher Caldwell. He bought the land upstream of our water source legally, which was what made it impossible to fight. Then he built a dam. Said it was for his own cattle operation. Reduced our flow to about a third of what we needed. He looked at his plate. My father spent 2 seasons trying to prove it was deliberate restriction. Couldn't get a lawyer to take the case. Couldn't get the county to rule on it. Couldn't afford to buy alternative water access because the ranch was already struggling. He picked up his fork. Third spring, we had nothing left. How old were you? 17 when it started. 19 when we left. A pause. My father died 4 years later. He never stopped talking about that land. Even at the end. Rosalie looked at him. I'm sorry. So am I, he said. Without theater. She thought about Gideon Pike. About the riders who had come to watch her dig. About the pattern Silas had identified, the acceleration. The timeline. The thing Pike was building toward that she still hadn't fully named but could feel the shape of. The way you feel weather before it arrives. What do you think Pike wants? She said. Not just my cattle. Silas set his fork down. He looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was how he engaged with things he was taking seriously. Water, he said. This basin, he said. Your creek is one of 3 permanent water sources in this section of the territory. The other 2 are on properties already in financial trouble. If Pike can acquire all 3 either through forced sale or by buying the debt, he controls water access for every operation in this valley. He looked at her. Your ranch isn't the target, your creek is. The room was very quiet. He's been planning this for a while, she said. I'd guess 2 years, Silas said. Maybe more. The drought this summer accelerated his timeline. But the strategy was already there. She looked at the table. At the water drawing, she still kept within arm's reach. Because looking at them reminded her that the problem had a solution. Which was something she needed to believe on the days when the problem felt larger than the solution. He needs me out before the fall sale. Yes, because if I make the sale and clear the debt, he can't use the debt to pressure Crow into calling the account. Yes, and if he can't use Crow, he loses one of his primary levers, Silas said. You're not just holding your own ranch, Rosalie. You're blocking a move that affects every rancher in this valley. She looked at him for a long moment. You figured all of this out from watching 2 riders sit at my fence line for 4 minutes, she said. I figured it out from watching Pike, he said, and from what you've told me about the settlement. And from having seen this pattern before in Wyoming. When I was too young to recognize it until it was too late. His voice was even. But there was something underneath it that had nothing to do with calm. I'm not too young now. Rosalie was quiet, then she stood up. Collected the plates and said, I need to talk to Amos Ketter. Silas looked at her. The rancher who borders your north fence. He's one of the other permanent water sources, she said. And he's been in my father's store account situation for 2 seasons running. She turned to face him. If Pike is building what you think he's building, Amos is already in his sights. He's also one of the men who's been saying you can't run this ranch alone, Silas said. Not to hurt her, just because it was true and they had established between them that true things were worth saying. I know that, she said. I'm going to go talk to him anyway. She went the next morning. She rode north along the fence line to where the Ketter operation began, a smaller ranch than Red Willow. Older buildings, the particular look of a property that had been competently managed for a long time by a man who was no longer young enough to manage it the way it needed. Amos Ketter was 63 years old and had been ranching this section of the territory for 40 years and had opinions about most things that had not been updated in approximately 30 of those years. He was at his barn when she rode in. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, not unkindly, but with the specific uncertainty of a man who hasn't fully recalculated his assessment of something. Rosalie, Wasn't expecting you, I know, she said. I need to talk to you about Gideon Pike. He went still. What about Pike? He's made an offer on my cattle, she said. Below market. Amos was quiet. Has he made you an offer, she said. A long pause. Came by 2 weeks ago, he said finally. Said the drought was making the season difficult, and he wanted to help any operations that were struggling. What was the number? He told her. It was lower than what Pike had offered her. Considerably lower. She kept her face neutral. Amos, she said carefully. What is the current state of your South Creek? He looked away. Running low. How low, he didn't answer immediately. She waited. About half what it usually runs this time of year, he said finally. Maybe less. I have a water system that's holding, she said. A diversion channel and holding pond. Ceaseless Rourke helped me grade it last week. She watched his face. I'd like to show it to you. He looked at her. The cowboy staying at your place. Yes, she said. No explanation, no apology. He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already calculated. Why would you show me, he said. We haven't exactly, he stopped. I know what you've said about me, she said quietly. I know what most of the settlement has said. I'm not here about that. Amos, I'm here because Pike is not trying to buy your cattle. He's trying to buy your water. She held his gaze. And if he gets yours and mine and the Hensey source on the east side, every rancher in this valley is going to be paying him for the right to water their cattle within 5 years. The silence stretched. A fly moved somewhere near the barn. That's a serious accusation, Amos said. It's a serious situation, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the pride and the stubbornness and the long habit of dismissing what she said before she finished saying it. All of it running against the particular intelligence of a man who had survived 40 years of ranching by recognizing threats before they arrived. Show me your water system, he said. She rode back to Red Willow with Amos Ketter following 20 feet behind her. And that felt like a kind of victory she hadn't fully expected. Quiet and solid and earned. Silas was at the channel when they arrived, checking the grade on the second section with the level balanced in his good hand. He looked up when the 2 horses came through the gate. He nodded at Amos without warmth or coldness, just acknowledgement. And he moved aside to give the older man room to look. Amos looked. He walked the length of the cut, studying the angle and the depth and the bank stabilization she'd done at the curve where the soil ran sandy. He crouched, which clearly cost his knees something, and pressed his hand into the earth, the way ranchers press their hands into earth reading it, asking it questions. Then he stood up and looked at Silas. You designed this? Silas said. I held the level. Amos looked at Rosalie. She said nothing. He turned back to the channel. The pond placement, he said. That's the key of it, isn't it? Keeping it covered. Reduces evaporation by about 40% in peak heat, she said. And it controls how much the cattle degrade the bank. He nodded slowly. How long to dig one this size? 3 days with 2 people, she said. Longer alone. He was quiet for a while. The July heat pressed down on all 3 of them, and nobody mentioned it. I've got 2 hired hands, he said finally. Through the end of the month. I've got the grade mapped, she said. And the materials. Another long pause. My wife thought your father was the best rancher in this basin, Amos said. It came out of nowhere, delivered in the flat tone of a man saying something he should have said a long time ago. She said it every year at the fall sale. I told her she was wrong. He looked at Rosalie. She wasn't wrong about your father. It was not an apology. It was not quite an apology, but it was the closest thing to one that Amos Ketter was apparently capable of producing. And Rosalie recognized it for what it was. Bring your hands tomorrow morning, she said. We'll start on yours the day after we finish mine. He nodded once. Got back on his horse, rode out without looking back. Silas came to stand beside her. They watched Amos go. He'll tell his neighbors, Silas said. I know, she said. Pike is going to find out that the ranchers are talking to each other. I know that too. she said. He's going to move on Crow, Silas said. Try to get the store account called before the sale. That's the fastest lever he has left. She turned to look at him. How fast? Maybe less. She looked back toward the road where Amos had gone. The dust from his horse was already settling. Then we need to make sure Crow has a reason not to call it. What kind of reason? The kind where he can see for himself that this operation is not failing, she said. I want him out here. I want him to walk this channel and see those cattle and look at the books. Silas looked at her. You'd show Harlan Crow your books? I'd show him whatever it takes to make him trust his own eyes over Gideon Pike's word, she said. Harlan is not a bad man. He's a cautious man. There's a difference. And I intend to use it. She wrote Harlan a letter that evening. Silas sat across the table and said nothing while she wrote. Which was the right thing to do, and she noticed it. She chose every word with care. She invited him to Red Willow Ranch. Not to discuss the account, but to see the ranch as it currently stood. She used her father's name once, deliberately, in a sentence that linked the operation's history to its current state. She did not apologize for anything. She did not ask for anything except his presence. She folded it and sealed it and set it aside for the morning stage rider. You write well, Silas said. I write to get results, she said. Same thing, he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the letter with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that was not quite admiration and not quite recognition, but carried elements of both. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I'm just thinking about what Pike is going to find when he comes back. What is he going to find? A woman who has already outthought him by 2 moves, Silas said. And who isn't finished yet. Harlan Crow came out 3 days later. He arrived in the late morning, driving his own wagon. Dressed more carefully than a ranch visit usually required, which told her he was nervous and compensating for it with formality. She met him at the gate. Thank you for coming, she said. Your letter was, he searched for the word direct. I try to be, she said. I'd like to show you the water system first. She walked him through it. All of it, the channel grade, the holding pond, the covered trough distribution, the bank stabilization. She explained each element in the language of practical ranching, not the language of persuasion, because she had learned that men like Harlan were more moved by understanding than by argument. She let him ask questions. She answered them completely. He crouched at the pond edge the way Amos had crouched, pressing his hand into the earth, reading it. Your father taught you this, he said. My father taught me to read water, she said. I designed the system. He stood up. He looked at the cattle in the upper pasture, well-fed, well-watered, in better condition than most operations in the valley right now, because she had been managing the drought correctly for 3 weeks. He looked at the channel. He looked at Rosalie. Has Pike made you an offer, he said. She told him the number. His expression shifted barely. But she saw it. That's considerably below what you know my cattle are worth, she said. Yes, he was quiet. She kept her voice even. I want you to ask yourself something. If I accept Pike's offer, who benefits? I clear the store account, barely. Pike acquires cattle below market value and, more importantly, removes my ability to hold this property through the fall. She looked at him steadily. And then what happens to this creek? He looked at her. Because I am not the only rancher in this valley whose water access is at risk, she said. And I am not the only one whose account at your store is under pressure this season. Harlan was very still. I'm going to make the fall sale, she said. The account will be settled in full. But I need you to hold the line for 4 more weeks. And I need you to hold it regardless of what you may hear from other parties about whether that's a wise decision. The silence stretched long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 4 weeks, he said finally. 4 weeks, she said. He drove out an hour later. Silas was at the fence line when she walked back, resting his leg against the lower rail with the particular quality of stillness he had when he was thinking rather than resting. He looked at her face when she came through the gate. "He'll hold," he said. "He'll hold," she said. He nodded. She sat on the fence rail beside him, and they were quiet for a while. Below them, the cattle moved through the upper pasture with the unhurried purposefulness of animals who had enough water and enough grass, and the held pond water system Rosalie had designed caught the afternoon light and held it. 3 days later, Amos Ketter arrived with his 2 hands as promised, and they spent a long hot day digging the first section of his channel while Rosalie walked them through the grade and the placement and answered every question straight. By late afternoon, when the heat had gone to its worst, and everyone was dirty and wrung out and completely satisfied in the way that only physical work with visible results produces, Amos's older hand, a man named Bert who had probably 45 years of work in his hands and didn't give anyone anything, easily looked at the channel and said, "This is a good design." He said it to nobody in particular. But Rosalie heard it. And that evening, when she was back at Red Willow and the supper was on and Silas was washing up at the pump, she stood at the kitchen window and allowed herself, for exactly 30 seconds, to feel the particular satisfaction of a thing being proved. 30 seconds. Then she went back to work, because the next morning, something changed. She was coming in from the cattle check when she saw a horse tied at her fence that she didn't recognize. A good horse. Well kept, the kind of horse a man ties at a fence when he intends to wait as long as necessary. And on her porch, sitting in her father's chair, with the ease of a man who had decided the chair was available, was a person she had never seen before. He was perhaps 50. Well dressed for the territory, with the clean hands of someone who did not do physical work and the patient expression of someone who did not need to. He stood when she came through the gate, which was the first mannered thing about him. And he took off his hat, which was the second. "Miss Mercer," he said. "My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm an attorney out of Billings." He held her gaze with the calm of a man delivering information he knows will land hard. "I've been retained by Mr. Gideon Pike, and I'm afraid I have some papers for you to look at." Rosalie stopped where she was. She looked at the papers in his hand. She looked at the horse at her fence. She looked at this man standing in her father's chair with his clean hands and his patient expression, and she felt something move through her that was not fear, though it was close enough to fear that another person might not have noticed the difference. She walked up the porch steps. She took the papers. She read them standing up in the full afternoon heat, without sitting down and without letting her expression change, because she had learned a long time ago that how you receive bad news is its own kind of information. And she was not going to give Gerald Whitmore from Billings any information she wasn't prepared to give. The papers were a legal claim. Pike was asserting prior water rights on the creek section that ran through the southern portion of Red Willow Ranch. He was claiming a water usage agreement dating back 7 years before her father's death. Before any drought, before any of this. He was claiming her father had entered into a verbal agreement to share the creek access, and that this agreement constituted a legal right. Her father, who was in the ground 11 days before she'd ever heard Gideon Pike's name in this context, who could not therefore say whether any such agreement had ever existed. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Gerald Whitmore. "This claim," she said, "references an agreement my father allegedly made." "That is correct," he said. "My father is dead." "Yes," he said, "I'm aware. I'm sorry for your loss." "Who witnessed this agreement?" she said. He paused. A very small pause, but she caught it. "The claim references Miss Pike's testimony and that of one additional party." "Who?" Another pause. "Harlan Crow," he said. The name hit her like cold water. She kept her face perfectly still. She said. She folded the papers. She looked at Whitmore with the steadiness of a woman who has been standing in this exact moment for her entire life without knowing at the moment where everything she has built is being tested against everything she has been told she cannot hold. "You'll receive my response within 5 days," she said. "Through proper channels." Whitmore nodded. He put his hat back on. He walked to his horse, untied. mounted with the ease of a man who expects to win, and rode out. Rosalie stood on the porch holding the papers and looked at the road long after the dust had settled. Then she turned and went inside. Silas was at the table. He had heard. She knew from the quality of his stillness, the kind that meant he had heard everything, and was waiting for her to decide what came next. She set the papers on the table in front of him. He read them without touching them, bending to look at each page with his hands flat on the table, which she noticed and understood. When he finished, he looked up. "Harlan," he said. "Harlan," she said. "He talked to you 3 days ago," Silas said slowly. "Agreed to hold the account, and now he's named as a witness to a 7-year-old verbal agreement." "Yes," she said. "Either he was lying to your face 3 days ago," Silas said, "or Pike is lying about Harlan's involvement." Rosa sat down. "There's a third option," she said. "Pike approached Harlan after our conversation. Offered him something, settled his own debt, maybe. Or made him a better arrangement. And Harlan made a decision." Silas was quiet. "He looked me in the eye," Rosalie said. "He stood at my water channel and asked about my father." Her voice stayed level. "I actually thought he was a cautious man, not a dishonest one." "Maybe he still is," Silas said carefully. "Cautious men under pressure make bad decisions." "I know that," she said. "It doesn't change what I have to do next." "What do you have to do next?" She looked at the papers. At her father's name, invoked in a legal document by a man who had never known him. To claim rights her father had never granted. Witnessness by a man her father had done business with for 20 years. "I need to find the original deed," she said. "Every water agreement my father ever made was written and witnessed and kept. He didn't make verbal agreements on land rights. Not once in 40 years." She stood up. "And I need to find it before Pike has time to establish the story." "Where would it be?" Silas said. "The deed box," she said. "In my father's desk." She was already moving down the hall. "And if it's not there, I need to know who else in this territory knew my father's business practices well enough to say so under oath." She went to the desk. She pulled the drawer. She lifted the deed box, which was heavy and familiar, and smelled of old paper and her father's particular way of organizing his life, which was methodical and careful and left nothing to chance. She opened it. She searched through it with steady hands. And then she stopped. Because the water agreement section, the folder her father had kept for every water usage arrangement on the property, going back to the original homestead, was there. But one page was missing. She could see where it had been. The slight irregularity in the stack. The faint pressure mark from a paperclip that had held something that was no longer there. She looked at the gap. She thought about who had been in this house. She thought about the days when she had been out working, and Silas had been in the house alone, and before Silas there had been. She stopped. She thought hard. There had been no one. No one had been in this house except her and Silas since her father died. Except, she closed her eyes, except the morning of the funeral, when the settlement women had come to help with the meal, and the house had been full of people moving through rooms she wasn't watching. And Harlan Crow had been among the mourners, and she had been at the grave and not in the house. And her father's desk had been in an unlocked room. She opened her eyes. She looked at the empty space in the deed box. Then she'd walked back out to the kitchen and put the box on the table in front of Silas and showed him the gap. He looked at it for a long moment. "The funeral," he said. "The funeral," she said. He sat back. The silence in the kitchen was the particular kind that comes after something has been named that cannot be unnamed. He took the documentation that would disprove the claim, he said. "Or prove that no such agreement existed," she said. "Which means the document itself may have been evidence that my father refused Pike's proposal." She looked at Silas. "Which means my father knew. He knew Pike was trying to make a move on the creek? And he said no, and he documented the refusal." Silas looked at her. "And then your father died," he said. The words landed in the quiet kitchen like stones in still water. She stood with her hands on her father's deed box and looked at Silas across the table. And for the first time in the 17 days since, she'd found that stranger near her south fence. She let herself feel the full weight of what she was standing inside. This was not a drought. This was not a difficult season. This was not a woman failing to manage a ranch that was too big for her. This was something that had been built carefully, over years, by a man who had learned that the best way to take what he wanted was to make the taking look inevitable. "He needs that document back," she said. "Yes," Silas said. "Which means he doesn't have it destroyed," she said. "He has it, because destroying it eliminates the leverage it gives him. But keeping it means he can withhold it depending on what the legal situation requires." Silas was watching her with the focused attention of someone watching a person solve a problem that matters. "Where does he keep documents like that?" "His operation is in Miles City," she said. "He has a lawyer there." "Whitmore?" she said. They looked at each other across the table. "I need a witness," she said. "Someone who knew my father's business practices. Someone the county would listen to." She was already thinking. "Someone who has no reason to lie for Pike and every reason to tell the truth." "Amos Ketter," Silas said. She looked at him. "Amos has been in this territory as long as Pike," Silas said. "He knew your father, and he watched Pike make the same offer to him that he made to you." He held her gaze. "He also just spent a day digging a water channel because you showed him what Pike was actually after." Rosalie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to ride to Amos tonight." "Yes," Silas said. He was already pushing back from the table. "You're not riding yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll stay. Hold the property." He met her eyes. "Go, Rosalie." She was saddled and out the gate in 15 minutes. The sun was going low and the shadows were long, and the land spread out around her the way it always spread out, familiar and demanding, and entirely indifferent to whether she rose or fell, and she rode hard because there was no other way to ride. When everything depended on what happened in the next 24 hours. Behind her, Red Willow Ranch sat solid and patient in the evening light, waiting the way it had always waited, for the woman who refused to let it fall. Amos Ketter opened his door with a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, which was the reasonable response to a rider coming hard up his lane after dark. When he saw it was Rosalie, he lowered the rifle. He did not lower the lantern. "What happened?" he said. She told him, standing on his porch in the cooling dark, still breathing hard from the ride. She told him all of it, the lawyer from Billings, the legal claim, the fabricated water agreement, her father's name on a document built from a lie. She told him about the missing page from the deed box. She told him about the funeral, and Harlan, and the gap in the paper stack where the refusal document should have been. She told him straight and fast, the way her father had taught her to deliver bad news, no softening. No detours, because detours wasted the time that the bad news required. Amos listened without interrupting. When she finished, the lantern light moved between them in the night air, and the silence stretched long enough that she could hear his cattle somewhere in the dark. Settling, breathing, doing what cattle do when the world is falling apart around them and they don't know it. "He used your father's name," Amos said finally. "Yes. James Mercer never made a verbal agreement on water rights in his life," Amos said. "I knew him for 32 years. The man documented everything. I watched him write down a handshake arrangement over a fence post loan because he said undocumented agreements were just arguments waiting to happen." "I know that," Rosalie said. "A judge in Miles City doesn't know that." Amos looked at her. The lantern made his face all shadow and angle, and the particular stubbornness she had been fighting against her entire life. But something in it tonight was different. Something had shifted since the afternoon in the water channel. Since he'd stood in the dirt with his hands pressed into her earth and read what she had built. "What do you need?" he said. "A sworn statement," she said. "Witnessed and filed with the county recorder before Pike's legal claim advances. Something that establishes my father's documented practice on water rights and contradicts the premise of the verbal agreement." She held his gaze. "And I need it tomorrow." "Amos," her voice stayed even. I know what you've said about me. I know you didn't believe this ranch would hold after my father. I'm not asking you to take that back. I'm asking you to tell the truth about a man you knew for 32 years. The lantern swayed slightly in the night wind. I'll be at your place by 7, he said. She rode home in the dark and found Silas awake at the kitchen table with the legal papers laid out in front of him and a cup of coffee at his elbow. He had been reading them for hours. She could tell by the quality of his attention when she walked in the particular focus of a man who has gone over something enough times to know exactly where the weaknesses are. Whitmore dated the claim filing for tomorrow morning, he said. Without looking up, she stopped that fast. Pike knew you'd received the papers today. He's pushing the clock. Silas finally looked up. If the claim is filed before you can establish contradicting documentation, the legal burden shifts. You'd be proving a negative proving the agreement didn't exist instead of Pike proving it did. She sat down. Amos will be here at 7. I can have the sworn statement drafted and ready for his signature before 8. You need a second witness to the statement, Silas said. She looked at him. Not me, he said. I have no standing in this county. A man nobody knows who arrived injured and has been living on your property for 2 weeks. Pike's lawyer will dismantle that in under 5 minutes. Who then? She said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Who knew your father's business practices besides Amos? She thought. She had been through the settlement in her mind a dozen times since she'd found the missing document, running through faces and histories, and what each person owed and what each person feared. There was a specific kind of courage required to stand against a man like Pike in a territory where Pike had money and a lawyer and patience, a courage that was different from digging a water channel or fixing a fence line. Because it cost differently, and the damage when it went wrong was different. Reverend Caldwell, she said slowly. He handled my parents' estate when my mother died. He would have seen documentation, and he witnessed the original deed transfer when my father expanded the property 12 years ago. Silas nodded. A reverend carries different weight in a county proceeding than a neighbor. He also has no financial relationship with Pike, she said. Which Amos technically does, since Pike made him an offer. Does that concern you? Amos's offer. It concerns me that a man who was offered money by Pike and refused it is a stronger witness than a man who was offered money and took it, she said. So no, it doesn't concern me. Silas looked at her for a moment with the expression that had become familiar to her over the past weeks, not admiration exactly, but something adjacent, the look of someone watching a mind they respect work through a problem at speed. You should sleep, he said. I know, she said. She didn't move. Rosalie, I'm thinking about Harlan, she said quietly. He was quiet too. We've done business for 7 years, she said. He extended credit after my mother died. He extended credit after 2 bad winters. He sat in this house at my father's table and ate my mother's cooking and called my father Jim. She looked at the papers. And then he took a document out of my father's desk on the day we put him in the ground. Silas said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and he seemed to understand that. I need to know if he was threatened, she said, or paid. Because those are 2 different things, and the response to them is different. You're going to talk to him, Silas said. It wasn't a question. After the sworn statements are filed, she said. Not before. I don't want him warned that I know. She slept 4 hours. It was enough. She had survived on 4 hours before and would again. And the particular adrenaline of a situation that required everything she had was, in its own brutal way, clarifying. She was up before first light, drafting the sworn statement at the kitchen table by lamplight, writing in the careful, precise language her father had taught her to use for anything that might need to hold up somewhere official. Silas sat across from her and said nothing, and that was exactly right. By the time the sky went gray, she had a clean draft. By the time Amos arrived, she had 2 copies. She walked him through it line by line, not rushing, letting him read everything himself and ask every question he had. Because a witness who fully understands what he is signing is a better witness than one who was hurried through it. He signed both copies. I'll ride for Reverend Caldwell, Amos said. When he'd finished, she looked at him. "I know where he lives," Amos said, with the slightly impatient tone of a man who doesn't want to be thanked for doing the obvious thing. "And my horse is fresher than yours. You stay here and hold the property." He was out the gate before she could answer. She stood in the yard and watched him go and thought. 32 years. Her father had known this man for 32 years. She had known him her whole life. And she had ridden to him last night, not because she was sure he would help her, but because he was the only one who could. And sometimes you went to people, not because you trusted them, but because the truth needed a voice, and they were the one who had it. He had said yes. That meant something. She filed it away and went back to work. Silas was at the channel when she came around the barn. He had the level in his hand and was checking the grade on the section they'd finished yesterday with the methodical attention he gave everything. As though the legal papers and the missing document and the filing clock in Miles City were not currently running. "How does it look?" she said. "Good," he said. "The overnight settling improved the bank on the east curve." The sandy section held. He didn't look up. "We can start the pond excavation today if you have the hands. Amos's men aren't coming until tomorrow. Then we start ourselves and they finish," he said. He finally looked up. "The work still needs doing." "Rosalie, whatever happens in Miles City today, the cattle still need water next week." She looked at him. "You're right. I usually am," he said, and the dry simplicity of it pulled something loose in her chest that was almost a laugh. They dug. It was honest work, and it required enough physical attention that it didn't leave much room for the kind of circular thinking that served nothing. She worked and he directed, and the pond excavation took shape the way the channel had gradually. Precisely, each hour revealing more of the design she had carried in her head for 2 winters. She had always known it would work. What she hadn't known was how it would feel to see it existing in actual dirt. Actual earth, actual Montana ground, that her father had homesteaded and her mother had loved, and that she had been fighting for, since the day she understood what fighting for something meant. It felt like proof, not proof for Pike or for the county recorder or for the settlement gossips. Proof for herself, which was the only kind that lasted. They were 3 hours into the pond excavation when Amos came back. He came through the gate at a pace that told her immediately that something had changed. He pulled up beside the channel and looked at Rosalie with the expression of a man who has found something he wasn't looking for. "Reverend Caldwell signed," he said. "Good," she said. "What else?" Amos looked Silas, then back at Rosalie. "He said something about your father, about Pike." He dismounted. "He said your father came to him about 8 months ago." Before the drought, before any of this started visibly, Rosalie went still. "What for?" "He wanted the Reverend to hold a document for him," Amos said. "Said he didn't want it in the house because he didn't trust that it would be safe there. Said if anything happened to him, the Reverend should give it to you." The shovel was in Rosalie's hands and she didn't remember gripping it harder. "Did he give it to you?" she said. Amos reached into his coat and produced an envelope. It was her father's handwriting on the outside. Her name, in the deliberate, careful letters he used when something mattered. The envelope was sealed with wax, her father's particular wax seal that she had watched him use 100 times on 100 documents that he had decided needed protecting. She took it, she held it for a moment. Silas had stopped working. Amos stood with his hat in his hand. Nobody spoke. She opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. Dated 14 months ago. It was a formal refusal, her father's name. Gideon Pike's name, a specific description of a proposed water rights agreement that Pike had brought to James Mercer in the spring of the previous year. And James Mercer's explicit documented witnessed refusal to enter into any such agreement now or in the future. At the bottom, 2 signatures witnessed it. One was Reverend Caldwell's. The other was Harlan Crow's. Rosalie read it twice. Then she looked up. "Harlan witnessed my father's refusal," she said. The words came out quiet and strange, because the information was reshaping everything she thought she'd understood about the last 3 weeks. Silas crossed to her in 3 steps and read the document over her shoulder without touching it. She heard his breath change a small, controlled sound that meant he was recalibrating. Pike doesn't know Caldwell had this, Silas said. No, Rosalie said. He took the copy from the deed box. He didn't know my father had made a second copy and given it to someone outside the house, and Harlan. Silas stopped. Harlan signed the refusal document 14 months ago, Rosalie said slowly. Which means either he genuinely doesn't know, Pike is now claiming he witnessed an agreement, or he does know and is being coerced. She looked at the page. A man doesn't sign a refusal document for a friend, and then 14 months later claim to have witnessed the agreement that the refusal was about. Not unless something has changed. What changed? Amos said. That, Rosalie said, is what I need to find out. She rode into the settlement alone. Silas argued with her about it, not loudly, not dramatically, but directly and seriously, in the way he argued about things he genuinely believed, and she heard him out completely, and then told him she was going alone. Because Harlan Crow in a room with Silas Rourke would spend the entire conversation finding reasons not to look at the thing he needed to look at. Some conversations required privacy. This was one of them. She tied Buttercup outside the mercantile and went in. Harlan was behind the counter with the expression he wore when he was expecting something he didn't want to see, which told her he already knew she was coming, or knew enough of the situation to expect her, which was its own kind of information. She put the legal papers on the counter. She put her father's refusal document beside them. She didn't say anything. He looked at both documents for a long moment. The store was empty except for the two of them. Rosalie, he said. His voice was different from any version of it she'd heard before. Dripped of the careful professional warmth he usually deployed. I need you to understand. Tell me what happened, she said. Straight, no working up to it. He looked at his hands on the counter. Pike came to me 6 weeks ago, he said, after your father died. He said he had documentation of a water agreement with your father, and that my signature on a witness statement would support the claim. He said that if I didn't provide the statement, he would call your store account through a creditor he controls, and I'd lose the merchandise debt your father carried for 20 years. He threatened you, she said. Yes, Harlan said. With something that would have hurt you financially. Yes. She looked at him. Harlan, did you take that document from my father's desk at the funeral? He closed his eyes. Yes. The word sat in the quiet store like something that had fallen from a height. He told me to, Harlan said. Said it was the only copy. Said without it, his claim had no contradicting evidence. He opened his eyes. I didn't know about Reverend Caldwell. Your father never told me he'd made a second copy. My father was a careful man, she said. Yes, Harlan said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the man across the counter from her, a man she had known since she was a child, who had fed her family's account through 2 hard winters, who had taken a document out of her father's desk on the day they buried him because he was afraid. She thought about what Silas had said. Cautious men under pressure make bad decisions. Not dishonest men. Cautious men. I need you to go to the county recorder's office in Miles City, she said. Today. I need you to file a retraction of any witness statement you may have provided to Gerald Whitmore and attach this document. She pressed her father's refusal page toward him as contradicting evidence. He stared at her. Pike will call my debt. Pike's legal claim falls apart the moment this document is filed, she said. Without a fabricated agreement, he has no water rights claim. Without the water rights claim, he has no leverage over any operation in this valley, including yours. You don't know that he'll Harlan. She leaned forward slightly. You signed my father's refusal 14 months ago because you believed in what my father was doing. You thought it was right. What Pike asked you to do 6 weeks ago, you know what that was. The silence stretched between them, long and heavy and full of things he hadn't said yet. I have a document from Reverend Caldwell, she said quietly, and a sworn statement from Amos Ketter, and a legal record that my father never made verbal agreements on water rights in 40 years of ranching. She held his gaze. You can add your retraction to that record and stand on the right side of this. Or you can stay where Pike put you. I cannot make that decision for you. Harlan Crow stood behind his counter for a long moment, with his hands flat on the wood and his face doing everything faces do when a person is working through the cost of doing the right thing versus the cost of not doing it. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out his coat. I'll need your copies, he said. Of both documents, she handed them across. Amos can ride with you if you need a companion. I'm not a coward, he said quietly. I know, she said. I never said you were. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not quite the usual careful warmth, but something more honest. Your father would have handled this the same way, he said. No, she said. My father would have handled it better. But I'm working with what I have. She was back at Red Willow by mid-afternoon. Silas was at the fence line when she came through the gate, and he read her face before she said a word. He'll file, she said. Good, he said. It won't be over when he does, she said. Pike won't walk away from this clean. He'll find another angle. Yes, Silas said. But the water rights claim is his primary lever. Without it, his timeline collapses. He looked at her steadily. You bought time, Rosalie. Real time. Enough to get to the fall sale. She looked at the channel. At the pond excavation. At the land that her father had loved and she had been fighting for, since the day she understood that love and work were the same thing dressed differently. There's something else, she said. Silas waited. The riders Pike sent to watch the channel, she said. They'll report back that we're farther along than he expected. That we've got Amos and his hands helping. That the water system is working. She turned to look at him. He's going to come here himself. Not Whitmore. Not riders. Pike. Silas was quiet for a moment when soon she said. When a man's plan starts failing, he stops sending intermediaries. What do you want to do when he comes? She thought about that. She thought about Gideon Pike on his horse outside her fence with his patient smile and his careful timing. Arriving when people were tired, speaking in the language of inevitability. She thought about her father's name on a fraudulent legal claim. She thought about the document that had been sitting with Reverend Caldwell for 14 months, waiting for exactly this moment. I want him to see the water system, she said. Silas looked at her. I want him to come on to this property and see what's been built and understand that the thing he spent 2 years planning to prevent has already happened, she said. I want him to see the channel and the pond and the cattle in the upper pasture and know that his window is closed. And if he doesn't accept that, then we have a legal document. 2 witnesses, and a sworn retraction from his own witness, she said. And he has a fraudulent claim and whatever lawyer bills he's accumulated. She looked at Silas. He's a man who plans in the dark. I want to make him stand in the light. Silas looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. They didn't have to wait long. Pike came the next morning. He came alone, which surprised her. Until she understood that he had come alone deliberately, no riders. No lawyer, no witnesses to whatever he intended to say. He rode up to the gate with the ease of a man who has decided to change his approach mid-strategy. Which is what a smart man does when his primary angle has been cut off and he needs to assess what remains. He looked at the channel. He looked at the pond excavation where Amos' 2 hands were working alongside the progress she and Silas had made. He looked at the upper pasture where the cattle were moving well. In good condition, the water system doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. She watched his face as he took all of it in. She watched the moment when he understood. Miss Mercer, he said. His voice was perfectly controlled. I see you've been busy, she said. He looked at Silas, who was standing to her left with his hands loose at his sides and his expression carrying exactly nothing that Pike could use. Then he looked back at her. I understand there may have been some confusion about a legal document. No confusion, she said. My father's documentation was quite clear, as was Reverend Caldwell's witness statement, as was Harlan Crow's retraction, which I believe was filed in Miles City yesterday afternoon. Something moved through Pike's face. Very fast, very controlled, but she saw Harlan, he said quietly. Harlan, she agreed. He was quiet for a long moment. The morning heat was building, and somewhere in the upper pasture, a cow called out to her calf and was answered. Ordinary sounds. Ranch sounds. The sounds of property that was alive and working and not going anywhere. "You've built something here," Pike said, finally. "Yes," she said. "I have that channel." He looked at it again. "That's not a temporary fix. That's a real system." "It is," she said. "My design, my labor, my land." He looked at her with the first expression she had seen from him that was not performing something. It was the look of a man doing an honest calculation about a situation that has moved beyond what he planned for. "The fall sale. 3 weeks," she said. He nodded slowly. He picked up his reins. He looked at the channel one more time. And at the cattle. And at the woman standing in front of her gate who had spent the past 3 weeks systematically dismantling everything he'd built. "Your father was a stubborn man," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know where I get it." Something crossed his face that might, in a different man, have been respect. He turned his horse and rode out. She watched him go. Silas came to stand beside her. Neither of them spoke until the sound of Pike's horse had gone entirely. Then Silas said quietly, "He's not done," she said. "But he's changed direction. A man like Pike doesn't keep pushing at a wall that isn't moving. He'll look for a different approach." She turned to look at him. "But that's a different problem for a different day." Silas looked at her for a moment. Then he said in the same quiet voice, "You know what today is," she thought. 21 days since I found you near the south fence." "Yes," he said. "And I've been here 21 days, and your operation is still standing, and your legal claim is documented, and your water system is working, and you have 2 neighbors who will stand up for you in a county proceeding." "We have 2 neighbors," she said. He looked at her. "You dug half that channel," she said. "You read Pike's strategy before I did. You held the level, and you didn't touch my father's tools without permission, and you let me handle Harlan alone, because you knew it needed to be handled that way." She looked at him steadily. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The Harrington contract," he said. "I sent word weeks ago that I wouldn't be making it. They found someone else." He looked at her directly. "I'm not going to Miles City." She had known that. On some level, for days. She hadn't let herself name it for the same reason she didn't name the other thing, the thing that had been building in the space between. Since the first, she'd hand him a bowl of salt pork and beans, and he'd said it smelled perfect. "Then what are you going to do?" she said. He looked at the channel. At the pond. At the land that had been the Mercer family's for 40 years, and that still had a second stake off the northeast corner that needed resetting before autumn, and a barn door brace that needed reinforcing before the first real wind, and a holding pond that needed a proper cover structure to get through the winter. "I thought I might stay on," he said, "if the terms were agreeable." She looked at him. At the gray at his temples and the calm in his hands and the 17 years of traveling written into his face. At the man who had looked at her water drawings and said this could work without pausing to decide how much weight to give them. At the man who had stood back from Harlan Crow because he understood that some conversations required privacy. At the man who asked before he touched her father's tools. "Every single time, room and meals against labor," she said. Same as before. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "Same as before," he agreed, but they both knew it wasn't the same as before. And neither of them said that either, because some things didn't need saying. They needed time and space and the slow accumulation of working days beside each other. And that was a thing that Red Willow Ranch had plenty of. She turned back toward the water system. "The pond cover needs framing before the temperature drops," she said. "I was thinking a simple lean-to structure, angled for drainage. The angle needs to account for the prevailing wind," he said. Falling into step beside her. "Which I know," she said. "Which I know you know," he said. They walked toward the pond together. and the morning opened up around them, and the cattle moved in the upper pasture, and the channel carried water exactly where Rosalie Mercer had always known it should go. 3 weeks stood between her and the fall sale. 3 weeks between her and the moment she would prove, in the most concrete way available, that Red Willow Ranch was not a failing property being managed by an incapable woman. It was a working ranch, and she was its rancher, and for the first time in 21 days, she let herself believe that the hardest part might actually be behind her. She was wrong about that, but she had 3 weeks before she would find out exactly how wrong. She was wrong about the hardest part being behind her. She found out exactly how wrong on a Tuesday morning, 10 days before the fall sale, when Silas came in from the cattle check with a look on his face that she had not seen him before, not the focused calm he wore when problems were manageable, not the tight quiet he carried when he was deciding how to say something difficult, but something underneath both of those. Something that told her the news was bad enough that he had spent the ride back from the pasture figuring out how to deliver it straight without it landing like a blow. "How many?" she said before he opened his mouth. He stopped. "In the northwest corner. They went down overnight. 11 cattle." In one night, 10 days before the sale, she was already moving toward the door. The northwest corner was the section she had worried about least, which was exactly the kind of irony that the land specialized in. The water system was functioning. The grass in that pasture had held better than anywhere else on the property because of the subsurface moisture pattern she'd been managing carefully all summer. She had checked those cattle 4 days ago, and they had looked fine, not just acceptable, but genuinely fine, the kind of fine that made you believe you had finally gotten ahead of the drought instead of just running alongside it. 11 of them were down now, clustered near the northwest trough. And the remaining cattle in that pasture were moving wrong, not the normal drift of a settled herd, but the restless, off-balance movement of animals that felt sick and didn't know what to do about it. She crouched beside the nearest downed animal. She checked its eyes. She pressed her hand against its flank and felt the heat coming off it in waves that had nothing to do with the August morning. "Fever," she said. "Yes," Silas said behind her. "Not drought stress," she said. "No," he said. "Something got into the water." She stood up and looked at the trough. It was the northwest trough, the one farthest from the new holding pond system, the one that still ran off the original creek diversion line, the one she hadn't upgraded yet because she'd been managing the southeast and upper pasture systems first, and the northwest had been holding adequately. She walked to the trough and looked at the water. It looked wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not black or obviously fouled, but wrong, in the specific way that water looks when something has been introduced to it that shouldn't be there. A slight discoloration at the edges, a smell that was off by just enough to notice if you were paying attention. "Someone put something in this trough," she said. The words came out flat and certain because she was flat and certain. The way she got when something made her angry enough that the anger turned all the way around and came out the other side as cold. Silas crouched beside the trough. He looked without touching. He smelled the water carefully, the way a man does when he's been working with animals long enough to know what bad water smells like in its various forms. He stood up. "Copper sulfate," he said, or something similar. "Enough to make them sick. Not enough to..." He stopped. "Not enough to kill them immediately," she said. "Enough to make them unsaleable at the fall market." Silence. "The timing," she said. 10 days before the sale," he said. "Which means if I pull them from the sale you don't cover the store account," he said. "And if you don't cover the account, Pike gets what he wanted without the legal claim," she said. She stood there beside the poisoned trough with 11 sick cattle on the ground behind her and 10 days until the only sale that mattered. And she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she could afford to feel it, which was about 30 seconds. Then she started calculating. "Can they be treated?" she said. "Some of them," Silas said carefully. "The ones that went down in the last few hours, yes. The ones that have been down since early night." He looked at her. I don't know yet. I need to look at each one, then start, she said. I'll ride for Amos. His voice stopped her. You need to report this to the county sheriff before you touch the trough. If this goes to a legal proceeding, you need a witness to the condition of the water before it's disturbed. She looked at him. He was right. She knew he was right. And she hated that he was right because every minute she spent waiting for a sheriff to ride out from town was a minute those cattle were staying sick. How long can the worst ones hold, she said. 4 hours, he said. Maybe 5. The sheriff's office is 2 hours out, she said. Can make it there and back in 4 if I push. Then push, he said. I'll start on the ones I'm certain about, the mild cases. I won't touch the trough and I won't disturb the worst affected animals until you're back. She was on Buttercup and out the gate in under 3 minutes. She rode harder than she had ridden since the night she'd gone to Amos in the dark. And she thought about Pike the entire way, not with the cold anger she usually managed, but with something hotter and more specific, because this was different from a fraudulent legal claim and a stolen document. Those had been the moves of a man working through systems, through paper and lawyers and the slow machinery of financial pressure. This was a man who had come onto her land in the dark and poisoned her cattle 10 days before her sale. This was personal in a way the rest of it hadn't been. And that told her something important. Pike was scared. A man who is winning doesn't poison cattle. A man who is winning has patience and time and the confidence of someone whose plan is working. A man who poisons cattle in the dark is a man who has watched his primary strategy fail and his secondary strategy fail, and has run out of legal moves and decided that what's left is the kind of move you make when you're desperate. She held on to that the whole ride to town. Sheriff Dale Morrow was a practical man who had been sheriffing in this county for 12 years and had the particular quality of attention that came from 12 years of distinguishing between people who were telling him the truth and people who were telling him what they wanted him to believe. He listened to Rosalie without interrupting, which she appreciated. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and then he got his horse. He rode back with her. He looked at the trough. He looked at the cattle. He took samples of the water with the equipment he carried for exactly this kind of situation. He wrote things in his ledger. He asked Silas what he had observed and when. And Silas answered with the same precise brevity that Rosalie had come to rely on. No embellishment. No gaps, no interpretation beyond what the facts supported. Then Morrow stood back and looked at the northwest corner of Red Willow Ranch and said, "You have any idea who did this?" Rosalie told him about Pike, about the legal claim, about the document from Reverend Caldwell, about Harlan's retraction, about the riders who had come to watch the channel and the way Pike's strategy had shifted each time she had closed one of his angles. Morrow listened to all of it. "That's a serious set of accusations," he said. "It's a serious set of events," she said. He looked at her. Then at Silas. Then back at the trough. "I'll ride out to Pike's operation today," he said. "I'm not making you any promises about what that produces. But I'll ride out. That's all I'm asking," she said. He left. She turned to the cattle. What followed was the hardest 3 days of her life since her father died. And her father's death had not required her to be this specific kind of present for this many consecutive hours without stopping. She and Silas worked the northwest pasture from before dawn to after dark, treating each animal individually, fluids forced, temperatures monitored, the particular patience of livestock care that cannot be hurried and cannot be delegated to someone who doesn't know what they're looking at. Amos sent his 2 hands over on the second day, and they worked without complaint alongside Rosalie and Silas in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was entirely focused. By the end of the second day, 8 of the 11 were standing. 3 were not. She stood over the 3 that weren't going to make it and let herself feel that too. She had raised some of these animals from calves. She knew their individual tendencies and temperaments, the way she knew the fence lines, not because someone had told her, but because she had been paying attention for years. These 3 were not abstractions. They were specific losses. and they deserve to be felt as specific losses rather than managed as a financial calculation. She gave herself 20 minutes. Then she calculated the financial damage. 8 recovered cattle, sold at market rate, would cover approximately 70% of the store account. She needed 100%. The gap between what she had and what she needed was the kind of gap that kept a person awake at 2 in the morning doing arithmetic that didn't change no matter how many times she ran it. Silas found her at the kitchen table that night with the ledger open and the lamp burning low, and the arithmetic written out 3 different ways because she kept hoping one of the versions would come out differently. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the numbers. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was doing his own version of the calculation, running it forward the same way she was, checking for an angle she might have missed. "The pawn structure," he said finally. She looked up. "I built it from materials you had on hand," he said. "But the cover framing, there's lumber left over. More than the structure required." He met her gaze. "That lumber has value. Not enough by itself, but it's something." "It's not enough," she said. "No," he agreed. "But there's something else." He was quiet for a moment. "Gray," she looked at him. "He's a well-bred horse," Silas said. "Well-trained. Anyone who knows horses would pay good money for him." A pause. "Better money than I'm likely to see from a single contract before the end of the season." She understood what he was saying. She sat with it for a moment. "No," she said. "No." She said again. And her voice was even and firm the way it got when a decision was made and she needed him to hear it. "That horse has traveled this territory with you for 3 years. I watched you talk to him when you thought nobody was listening. You are not selling Gray to cover a gap in my store account." He looked at her. "It's not your decision. You are a hired hand on this property," she said carefully. "Which means decisions about what gets sold here are mine. And I am telling you that Gray is not on the list." They looked at each other across the table. "You are the most frustrating woman I have ever met," he said. "Good," she said. "Then you understand what Puck has been dealing with." Something shifted in his face, that almost smile she had learned to watch for. "There has to be another way to close the gap," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going to find it." She found it the next morning. She found it because of Prudence Vale, which was the last thing she would have predicted. Prudence arrived at Red Willow just after sunrise with a basket and the particular expression of a woman who has been arguing with herself for several days and has finally landed on a decision. She set the basket on the porch and looked at Rosalie with something Rosalie had not seen in her face before. "I heard about the cattle," Prudence said. "Word travels," Rosalie said. "It does." Prudence was quiet for a moment. "I also heard about what you did for Amos Ketter's water system. And what you've been doing for the valley." She paused. "I owe you an apology for the things I said when that cowboy arrived." "About your reputation." Rosalie looked at her. "Prudence, I was wrong," Prudence said, in the flat, decisive tone of a woman who has made her peace with a difficult fact. "I was looking at the wrong things and making judgments about a situation I didn't understand." She picked up the basket. "There are 6 women in this settlement whose husbands have accounts at Crow's store. Women who have been watching what you're doing since the funeral. Women who," she started again. "We'd like to help. If you'll let us." Rosalie stared at her. "It's a loan," Prudence said quickly. "Not charity. A loan against the cattle sale proceeds, structured so that you pay it back in 60 days with no interest. 7 women, divided equally. Small enough that nobody is endangered, but large enough, combined to close the gap." She held out the basket. "The terms are inside." Rosalie didn't move for a moment. Then she took the basket. She read the terms, standing on the porch in the morning heat, with Prudence Vale watching her with the careful attention of a woman who has come a long way from where she was a month ago and knows it. The terms were exactly what Prudence had described. Fair, specific. No ambiguity, no hidden condition. No version of the arrangement that put Rosalie in a worse position if something went wrong. 6 women. one of whom was Amos Ketter's wife. "How long have you been planning this?" Rosalie said. "Since the day Amos came home and told me about your water channel," Prudence said. "He couldn't stop talking about it. Said your father's daughter had built something nobody else in the valley had thought to build." She looked at Rosalie steadily. "I figured a woman who could do that could pay back a loan in 60 days. Rosalie looked at her for a long moment. "I'll accept the terms," she said. Prudence nodded. She turned to go. "That cowboy," she said. "Without turning around, Silas," Rosalie said. "He's a good man?" Rosalie thought about 21 days. She thought about the broom handle crutch, and the water drawings, and the gray horse, and the tools he never touched without asking. She thought about a man who had stood back from a conversation with Harlan Crow because he understood that some conversations required privacy. Prudence nodded once. "Good," she said, and walked to her wagon. The loan closed the gap. Combined with the recovered cattle at market rate and the lumber, she was within reach of full settlement. Not comfortable reach close enough that a hard wind would matter, but reach. She laid it all out in the ledger that evening and ran the numbers until they stopped changing. Silas sat across from her and didn't pretend he wasn't watching. "It works," she said. "Yes," he said. Barely is enough," he said. She looked at the ledger. "You know what the worst part of this past month has been?" He waited. "Not Pike," she said. "Not the legal claim or the poison trough or the 3 cattle we lost." She closed the ledger. "The worst part has been doing all of this while people watched and waited for me to fail, and I couldn't let myself fall apart even once, because falling apart costs time." She looked at him. "Not even when they poisoned my cattle. I couldn't stop. I just had to keep calculating." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "I know," he said. "Just that. Not I'm sorry, not I understand." "I know." Like he'd carried something similar long enough to recognize its shape. She looked at him. "When your father lost the ranch," she said. "What did you do?" "I told myself it was practical. That there was nothing left to hold and staying, would only he stopped. I didn't let myself fall apart either. I just kept moving. Kept working. Made moving into the thing I was good at so I didn't have to notice I was running." "What made you stop running?" she said. He looked at her directly. "Or this." He gestured at the ledger. "The kitchen, the window, and the dark beyond it. Watching someone hold ground I thought was impossible to hold. Watching someone refuse every version of giving up that the situation offered." He held her gaze. "It reminded me that I used to believe in something. Before Wyoming." The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you believe in?" she said. "That land is worth fighting for," he said. "That the fight is worth more than the safety of not fighting." He looked down at the table. "I forgot that for a long time." She sat with that. Then Sheriff Morrow's report arrived, which was not how she had expected the evening to go. His deputy rode out just before dark with a letter, and she read it at the kitchen table, with Silas across from her and the lamp burning between them. Morrow had ridden to Pike's operation. He had found the evidence he needed: traces of copper sulfate in quantities inconsistent with any legitimate use, stored in a location that suggested recent transport. He had found a hired man who, when questioned with the specific kind of persistence that a 12-year sheriff applies when he suspects someone knows more than they're saying, had admitted to riding to Red Willow 3 nights ago on Pike's instruction. Pike had been formally charged. He was not in custody yet. He had resources and lawyers, and the ability to complicate the timelines, but the charge was filed, and the evidence was documented, and Gideon Pike was, for the first time in this entire situation, on the defensive. Rosalie read it twice. She set the letter down. She looked at Silas. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he had when something mattered, and he wanted to see how she received it. "He's charged," she said. "Yes," Silas said. "It won't be resolved before the sale," she said. "Legal proceedings take time." "No," he agreed. "But it changes his position. A man under criminal investigation has a much narrower ability to apply financial pressure to a county sale process." She thought about that. "It also means the other ranchers know," she said. Once Morrow's filing is public, the Valley understands what Pike was actually doing. Not just to me. Yes, Silas said. She sat with the letter in her hands and thought about the chain of it from the document in Reverend Caldwell's keeping to Harlan's retraction to Amos's sworn statement tomorrow, writing out to Pike's operation. Each link connecting to the next, because she had food fast enough and trusted the right people and refused. Every single time to let the pressure make her sloppy. Her father had built this ranch by understanding that the land rewarded people who paid attention. She had built this defense the same way. Go tell Amos, Silas said. Tonight, he deserves to know before he hears it from someone else. She looked at him. It's after dark. He was up when you rode to him at night a week ago, Silas said. He'll be up. She rode to Amos. He was on his porch when she arrived. Which meant either he was expecting her, or he was the kind of man who sat on his porch in the dark, because the dark was quieter than the house. Which was something she understood completely. He looked at her face when she came through the gate and said, "What happened?" She told him about Morrow's letter. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "I want to tell you something," he said finally. She waited. "My wife was right about your father," he said. "And she would have been right about you too, if I'd given her the chance to say it." He looked out at the dark. "I've spent 30 years thinking I could judge a rancher by looking at them. Size, age, whether they had a man standing beside them." He shook his head. "I looked at you and I saw a woman who was going to fail because I decided she was going to fail. And you spent the whole summer proving me wrong without once asking me to admit it." Rosalie sat on his porch in the dark and chose her words carefully. "I didn't do it to prove you wrong, Amos," she said. "I did it because it was my land and my father's work, and I wasn't going to let it go." "I know that," he said. "That's what I'm telling you. You weren't doing it for me. You weren't doing it for any of us." He looked at her. "And that's exactly why it worked." She rode home with the night air against her face and the letter in her pocket and something in her chest that she hadn't had room for in a long time because she'd been carrying too much else. Something that felt like being seen. Not rescued, not managed. Not assessed by someone deciding how much weight to give her. Just seen, straight and complete, the way you see something, when you've finally stopped looking for reasons not to. Silas was on the porch when she got back. He had 2 cups of coffee. Hers had clearly been waiting long enough to be perfectly drinkable, which meant he'd timed it deliberately. She tied Buttercup and came up the steps and took the cup and sat in the other chair. "Amos," he said. "Good," she said. "He's good." They drank their coffee. The night was cooling towards something that was almost comfortable after the punishing heat of the day. And somewhere below in the recovered pasture, cattle moved in the particular rhythm of animals that had enough water and were no longer afraid. 7 days, he said. To the sale. To the sale, he agreed. She looked out at the dark. "I've been thinking about after," she said. He turned to look at her. "After the sale, after the account is settled. After all of this." She turned her cup in her hands. "My father used to say that the time to plan the next thing is while you're still fighting the current thing. So that when the fighting stops, you don't lose the momentum." "What's the next thing?" Silas said. "The northeast pasture," she said. "I've been thinking about it for 2 years. The subsurface moisture pattern extends farther than my father realized. If I divert a secondary line from the new holding pond, I can open up another 40 acres of usable pasture." She looked at him. "That's more cattle. More cattle means a stronger position at next year's sale. A stronger position means the store account stays current and the operation grows instead of just surviving." She had never said that out loud to anyone. Not growing. Not just surviving. Growing. The silence between them held the word carefully. "That's a bigger job than the channel," Silas said. "I know," she said. "You'd need more hands." "Probably," she said. "Or the right hand for long enough." He was quiet. She looked at him. He looked back. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not asking you to stay because I can't manage without you. I managed before you arrived, and I would manage if you left, and we both know that. She held his gaze. I am asking you to stay because the work is better with you in it. Because you look at my drawings and tell me what's sound without deciding in advance how much weight to give them. Because you understand the difference between helping and deciding for someone. She paused. And because I am very tired of making 2 cups of coffee and remembering I only need 1. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was not the almost smile, and not the focused calm, and not the careful attention. Something quieter and more fundamental than any of those. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She nodded. She turned back to the dark. They sat on the porch and finished their coffee, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else. Because some things were large enough to sit with in silence, and small enough to carry in ordinary gestures, a cup of coffee at the right temperature, a chair pulled to the right position, a man who understood that staying could mean something entirely different from rescuing. 7 days. She would hold for 7 more days, and then she would walk into the fall sale, and she would sell her cattle at their real value, and she would come home to Red Willow Ranch, and she would start planning the Northeast pasture. And when she woke up the next morning, she would make 2 cups of coffee. And she would not put one away. She made 2 cups of coffee every morning for 7 days. She didn't mention it. Silas didn't mention it. It simply became part of the morning, the way everything that mattered eventually became part of the morning quietly. Without ceremony, the way permanent things arrive when you stop waiting for them to announce themselves. The sale was on a Friday. She was up 2 hours before dawn. Silas was already at the barn when she got there, which meant he had been up before her. Which meant he had not slept well either, which was something she noted and did not say anything about. They worked the cattle through the pre-dawn dark with the efficiency of 2 people who had spent enough consecutive days at the same task that they no longer needed to talk through it. She moved the herd. He checked the gate positions. She counted heads. He confirmed the count. They loaded the sale cattle into the drive formation by the time the sky went gray. And she stood at the head of the herd and looked back at the animals her father had started, and she had kept through a summer that had tried every method available to take them from her. 8 recovered cattle, 43 healthy head, 51 animals in condition that she would put against any operation in the valley. Ready? Silas said from his horse. Yes, she said. They drove to the fall sale. The sale ground was already busy when they arrived, riders moving stock. Buyers walking the lines, the particular noise and smell of a large animal gathering that Rosalie had been attending, since she was small enough that her father carried her on his shoulders to see over the fence rails. She knew this ground the way she knew Red Willow. She knew its rhythms and its hierarchies, and which buyers were worth approaching early and which ones needed to see you confident and unhurried before they'd take you seriously. She rode in without hesitation. The reaction was immediate, and she had expected it, heads turning. Conversations pausing, the specific quality of attention that a community gives to someone they had been watching all season and were now recalibrating their assessment of. She had heard about Pike's charges through the Valley grapevine before the official posting, which meant everyone at this sale had heard too. She had known they would. She had planned for it. What she had not planned for was Amos Ketter meeting her at the gate. He was on his horse, hat in hand, with the expression of a man who has decided to do something publicly that costs him something privately. And he held his position at the gate until she rode up. Rode in early, he said. Wanted to be here when you arrived. She looked at him. My wife said if I didn't come meet you at the gate, she wouldn't speak to me until Christmas, he said. But that's not why I'm here. Why are you here? Amos, because people are watching, he said simply. And I want them to see where I'm standing. He turned his horse and rode beside her into the sale ground. That was the moment the day changed. Because Amos Ketter had been ranching this valley for 40 years and everyone knew it. And Amos Ketter riding in beside Rosalie Mercer at the fall sale was not a small gesture. It was a public declaration delivered in the language that ranchers understood better than any other, not words. Not documents, not legal filings, but physical. visible, undeniable presence by the time she reached the buyer's line. 2 other ranchers had fallen in alongside her, then a third. She kept her face composed, and her back straight, and her eyes forward, because this was not the moment to let herself feel what she was feeling, which was something enormous and warm and dangerously close to the surface. The first buyer was a man named Patterson, who ran a large feeding operation east of Miles City, and who had bought from her father for 15 years. He looked at her cattle with the focused assessment of a professional and asked 3 questions: condition, water history, any illness in the herd this season. She answered all 3 straight. On the third answer, yes. 11 head were treated for copper sulfate poisoning resulting from deliberate contamination. 8 recovered fully. She had the sheriff's report if he wanted to review it. Patterson stopped and looked at her directly for the first time. "You have the report on you," he said. She reached into her coat and handed it to him. He read it. He was quiet. Then he handed it back and looked at her cattle again, and named a price that was above what she had calculated as her best-case market rate. She kept her face neutral. "That's acceptable," she said. He stuck out his hand. She shook it. That was the first sale. The second buyer was less straightforward. He was younger, newer to the territory, and he had clearly heard a version of the summer's events that had been filtered through sources she couldn't identify. He looked at her recovered cattle with skepticism that he was not entirely hiding. He asked about long-term health effects of the contamination. He asked whether she could guarantee the animals. "I can show you their current condition," she said evenly. "I can show you the treatment record and the timeline and the sheriff's documentation of the source of the contamination. I cannot guarantee any animal against future illness any more than you can. That's not what a cattle sale is." She held his gaze. "What I can tell you is that these animals were treated correctly, recovered fully, and have been on a functioning water system for the past 3 weeks. Their condition reflects that." He looked at them again. Silas, who had been standing 3 feet back and slightly to her, left the entire morning in the specific position of a man who is present and available but not intruding, said quietly to the buyer, "I've been working that water system since it was dug. You won't find better hydrated stock in this sale ground." The buyer looked at Silas, then at the cattle, then at Rosalie. He named a fair price. She took it. By midday she had sold 38 of her 51 head at prices that ranged from fair to excellent. She had 13 head remaining, all of them healthy, and 2 buyers she hadn't yet approached. The account total was in her head, running continuously against the store balance and the loan from Prudence's group and the cost of the cattle she'd lost. She did the arithmetic at the water trough while the cattle drank. She was close. Very close. But the 13 remaining head needed to sell at a specific minimum to close everything out. And the 2 remaining buyers were the kind of men who sensed when a seller needed a sale and adjusted their offers accordingly. Silas came up beside her. "How does it stand?" She told him the number she needed from the remaining 13. He was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "But it requires a buyer who values condition over price testing. Then find one who hasn't been approached yet," he said. She looked at the sale ground. She knew every buyer here. She ran them through her mind the way she ran fence lines methodically. No gaps, every section assessed before she moved to the next. And then she landed on a name she had not considered because she had not thought he was here this year. Thomas Reeve. He was a ranch consolidator out of Billings, who came to the fall sale every 3rd year and bought in large quantities when he found what he wanted. He valued consistent quality over low prices because his operation resold to Eastern buyers who paid premium rates for premium stock. He had bought from her father twice. He had not been at the last 2 sales. But he was here now. She could see his horse at the far line. His particular way of standing when he was watching a herd slightly back. Arms crossed, the patient posture of a man who buys when he's ready and not before. "Stay with the herd," she said to Silas. She walked across the sale ground to Thomas Reeve. He saw her coming from 20 feet out and watched her approach with the neutral expression of a man who is always assessing. "Miss Mercer," he said. "I'd heard you were running the operation now." "Since spring," she said. "I have 13 head left. I'd like you to look at them." "I've heard there was illness in your herd this season," he said. "Deliberate contamination," she said. "Copper sulfate in the northwest trough." 8 of 11 affected animals recovered fully. The 13 I have left were not in the affected pasture. "I have the sheriff's documentation." She paused. "I also have a new water system that I designed myself, which is why my cattle are in better condition than most operations you'll see today, despite the worst drought this valley had in 6 years. He looked at her for a moment. "Show me," he said. She walked him to the herd. He looked at the 13 remaining cattle with the thorough, unhurried attention of a professional who trusts his own eyes more than anyone's word. He checked confirmation, condition, movement. He spent 12 minutes doing it and said nothing during those 12 minutes, which she understood and did not try to fill. Then he looked at Rosalie. "Your father built a good herd," he said. "I've kept it," she said. "You've improved it," he said. "The conditioning on these animals is better than what James was selling 3 years ago." He looked at her steadily. "That's not an axagaze." "No," she said. "It isn't." He named a price. It was above her minimum. She had to work to keep her face from showing what that meant. "Done," she said. She extended her hand. He shook it. Firmly. The handshake of a man who respects a transaction conducted straight. She walked back across the sale ground with the number in her head, and the arithmetic resolving itself with each step into something clean and final. By the time she reached Silas, she had run it 4 times. She stopped in front of him. "It's done," she said. He looked at her. He read her face. And he did something she hadn't expected. He looked away for a moment. Toward the cattle, toward the sale ground, in the deliberate way of a man who needs a second before he trusts his own expression. When he looked back, he was composed. But she had seen the second. "Full settlement," he said. "Full settlement," she said. "Loan repaid. Store account cleared. Enough remaining to start the northeast pasture work before winter." He was quiet. "Silas," she said. "I know," he said. His voice was even, but something underneath it was not. "I know." She looked at him. "You thought I might not make it." "I thought it would be close," he said carefully. "But part of you thought I might not make it." He met her eyes. "Part of me was terrified you might not make it," he said. "And I didn't know what to do with that because it wasn't my ranch and it wasn't my call, and I couldn't do anything about the part that was terrified except keep working." She had not expected that level of honesty. She stood with it for a moment, turning it over, understanding the weight of what it cost him to say it. "That's the most you've told me about what you were feeling in 7 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have said it sooner." "No," he said. "I couldn't. Because if I'd said it, it would have made the fear real in a way that wasn't useful to you. And you didn't need my fear. You needed my hands." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "Silas Rourke," she said, "you are the most considered man I have ever met." Something in his face opened in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile. Something fuller than that. They drove the sold cattle to their new owners and collected the payments and completed the paperwork with the methodical thoroughness that her father had always brought to the fall sale. Because the paperwork was the proof, and the proof was the thing that lasted. She signed her name on every document clearly and completely. Rosalie Mercer. Red Willow Ranch, and she did not let her hand shake once. It was late afternoon before they started back toward home. She stopped at Crow's Mercantile first. Harlan was behind the counter when she came in, and he looked at her with the careful expression of a man who has been waiting for this moment and is not entirely sure what form it will take. She put the full settlement on the counter. She watched him count it. He counted it twice. Then "Rosalie," he said quietly. "The account is cleared," she said. He paused. "I owe you more than that. You filed the retraction," she said. "That's what mattered. I took the document," he said. From your father's desk, I Harlan. She kept her voice level. You were scared and Pike used that. You made a decision under pressure that you corrected before it cost anyone what it could have cost. She met his gaze. I've seen enough of this summer to understand that people under pressure make choices they wouldn't make otherwise. What I pay attention to is what they do when they get the chance to correct it. She picked up the receipt he'd written. You corrected it. He was quiet for a moment. Your father would have said the same thing, he said. I know, she said. I learned it from him. She walked out of Crow's Mercantile into the late afternoon with the receipt in her hand and the account settled and every number in her ledger resolved, and she stood outside on the wooden walkway for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of it, the complete, uncomplicated reality of a thing that was done. Silas was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face and he knew. He didn't say anything. He just handed her Buttercup's reins and mounted Gray, and they rode out of the settlement side by side. And the late sun was long and golden across the basin, and the cattle were settled and the account was cleared, and Red Willow Ranch was still standing. They were halfway home when Silas said, I need to tell you something. She glanced at him. Before I rode into your south fence line, he said. I was considering not going to Miles City at all. She looked at him more directly. What do you mean? The Harrington contract, he said. I'd been on the road for 3 years. Longer. 15 years of moving. Camp to camp, contract to contract, never staying anywhere long enough for it to matter. He was looking ahead. Not at her. I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I was riding toward Miles City because I had a contract, and because stopping made no sense, and because I had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to be anywhere that was. He paused. Anywhere that asked something real of me. She waited. I fell because Gray spooked at a rattlesnake, he said. That part's true, but I had been riding inattentively for 2 days. Not watching the ground the way I should have been. Because I didn't care enough about where I was going to watch it carefully. He looked at her then. I wasn't careless with your property. Not once. Not from the first day. She understood what he was telling her. She sat with it while Buttercup moved beneath her and the land spread out around them in the long late light. You stopped running, she said. Yes, he said. Because of a ranch that was failing. Because of the woman who refused to let it, he said. They rode in silence for a while. The thing that had been building between them since the first bowl of salt pork soup and the first look at the water drawings and every morning of 2 coffee cups had reached the place where silence was no longer large enough to hold it. She knew that. She suspected he knew it too. What she didn't know was how to cross from what they had been to what they were becoming without losing anything of what had made the crossing possible, the specific, careful, earned quality of 2 people who had built something together and trusted each other with the building. They came through the gate of Red Willow Ranch in the last of the evening light. She dismounted at the barn and stood with Buttercup's reins in her hand and looked at the property, the channel. The pond, the covered trough system, the repaired fence lines. The barn with its reinforced brace, the house with its swept porch and its 2 coffee cups waiting for morning. She had been looking at this land her whole life. It looked different now. Not bigger, not more dramatic, just more fully hers. Like something she had been borrowing without knowing it, and had finally, today, genuinely claimed. I want to show you something, she said. Silas came up beside her. She walked him around the east side of the house to the corner where the old foundation stones were laid from when her father had talked about expanding the house and never got around to it. She had thought about this corner for weeks. She had thought about it while digging the channel and treating the cattle and signing documents and riding in the dark and watching Silas's face when he thought she wasn't looking. She stopped at the corner. My father laid these stones 12 years ago, she said. He always meant to build a room onto this side of the house. More storage, he said. Or another bedroom if the operation grew enough to need a permanent hand. Silas looked at the stones. He looked at her. The operation has grown, she said. He was very still. I'm not asking you to build it as a hired hand, she said. I'm not asking you to stay because I need the labor, or because the northeast pasture is a bigger job than one person can manage, or because the mornings are easier with someone else in the kitchen. She turned to look at him directly. I'm asking you because this is the only place in 7 weeks where I have felt like myself completely. Not the version of myself I show the settlement, or the version I show Pike, or the version I show people who need me to be capable so they don't use it against me. Just myself. She held his gaze, and that is because of you. He looked at her for a long moment. Rosalie, he said, and her name in his mouth had the quality of something being held carefully. Don't thank me, she said. That's not what this is. I know it isn't, he said. I was going to say he stopped. He looked at the foundation stones. He looked at the house. He looked at the land around them in the last of the light. And whatever he was working through, he worked through it in the particular quiet way. He worked through everything that mattered. Then he looked at her. I've been building things for other people's ranches for 15 years, he said. I've never built anything for a place that was going to last. This one will last, she said. Yes, he said, I know it will. He looked at the cornerstone. That one's not level, he said. She looked, he was right. The northeast cornerstone sat slightly off from true. A fraction of an inch that her father had probably meant to correct and hadn't gotten back to. I know, she said. It's been bothering me for 12 years. We should fix it, he said. Yes, she said. We should. He looked at her with the full version of the expression she had been seeing fragments of since the first morning, not the almost smile. Not the careful attention, but something that had all of those things in it and was larger than any of them. Something that had been building through 7 weeks of shared work and shared risk, and the particular intimacy of two people who have learned to trust each other in the ways that actually matter. Rosalie Mercer, he said, I would like to stay on this property for considerably longer than the northeast pasture requires. How much longer, she said. Permanently, he said, if you'll have me. She looked at the foundation stones. She looked at the house. She looked at the man standing in the last of the evening light with the gray at his temples and the calm in his hands, and 15 years of moving finally come to rest. Fix the cornerstone first, she said. He almost smiled. Then help me square it, he said. She went and got the level. They married before the month was out quietly, in the settlement with Reverend Caldwell and Amos Ketter and his wife and Prudence Vale, and Harlan Crow standing in the front 2 rows. It was not a large ceremony. It was not an elaborate one. It was the kind of ceremony that happens when 2 people have already done the work, and the ceremony is simply the formal recognition of what is already true. Harlan cried, which surprised everyone, including Harlan. Prudence did not cry, which surprised no one, but she squeezed Rosalie's hand on the way out with a firmness that said everything she would not say out loud. Amos shook Silas's hand for a very long time. They drove home in the early afternoon under an August sky that had finally broken from the relentless heat of the summer into something cooler and cleaner. The kind of air that came before autumn and carried in it the suggestion of rain. She had been right about that too. The rain came 2 days later. It came the way Gooden came to Red Willow Ranch, not dramatically. Not with fanfare, just steadily and sufficiently. Soaking into the ground that had been waiting for it, and running through the channel she had built, and filling the holding pond that would carry the water through winter, and feeding the creek that Gideon Pike had spent 2 years trying to claim, and that now ran through her land as it had always run. Clear and cold and entirely hers. She stood on the porch and listened to it fall. Silas came out and stood beside her with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. She took it. Below, the cattle moved slowly in the upper pasture with the unhurried purposefulness of animals who had enough and knew it. The channel ran full. The pond sat quiet and covered against evaporation. The northeast corner of the house had a new foundation stone laid true and level, waiting for the walls that would follow in the spring. Gideon Pike's legal case would take months to resolve. She knew that. She knew there were ranchers in this valley who still had hard seasons ahead of them, and that her water system was not the end of anyone's struggle, but the beginning of a different kind of fight, the daily. practical, unglamorous fight to hold land against everything that wanted to take it. She knew that trust rebuilt slowly, and that some things her father had known would take her years to fully understand, and that some things she understood already that she had not yet found the words for. She knew all of that, and she held her coffee and listened to the rain and felt the particular peace of a person who has done what they said they would do, not perfectly, not without cost, not without the help of people who had chosen to stand beside her, but completely. Red Willow Ranch had survived the summer. Not because Silas Rourke had arrived at her south fence line. Not because Amos Ketter had changed his mind, or Prudence Vale had organized 6 women, or Harlan Crow had finally done the right thing, or Reverend Caldwell had kept a document for 14 months. It had survived because Rosalie Mercer had decided, standing over her father's fresh grave in the July heat, with blistered hands and an empty stomach, that it would. Everything else had followed from that. Silas reached over, without looking at her, and straightened the coffee cup in her hand that had tilted slightly. A small automatic gesture, the kind of gesture that belongs to people who have learned each other's habits without trying to. She let him. She looked out at the rain falling on her land. 2 hats hung beside the ranch door. 2 horses stood in the barn. 2 coffee cups sat on the porch rail, and beyond them, cattle drank quietly from the water system that everyone had said would fail. In the valley that a man had tried to control and could not. On the land that a woman had refused to lose and never did. Rosalie Mercer had not survived this summer because she was rescued. She had survived it because she was the kind of woman who pulled dying strangers out of the July heat and fixed water systems and rode in the dark and stood in front of lawyers without flinching and made 2 cups of coffee every morning, even before she knew why. She had survived it because she was exactly who she had always been. And Silas Rourke had not saved her. He had simply been wise enough to recognize what he had found and strong enough, finally, to stop moving long enough to stay. The rain fell on Red Willow Ranch. And it was enough, and it was theirs, and it would last.